Welcome to The Common Bridge, where policy and current events are discussed in a fiercely nonpartisan manner. The host, Richard Helppie, is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and political analyst who has over 1 million listeners around the world. The Common Bridge is available on Substack.com and draws guests and audiences across the political spectrum.
Hello and welcome to The Common Bridge with one of our favorite guests from Australia today, Mr. Robert Greenfield. Robert, great to see you.
Wonderful to see you, Rich. Where are you today?
I am in the western part of the United States, and I understand you're in the western part of Australia.
Yes, we seem to both be on the edge of the continents there. I can see some mountains in the back for you.
Indeed. We are nominally open here in Riverside County, but a little bit to our east, not quite the case. And what an interesting time. For those of you that might be new to Mr. Greenfield, his bio will be on Substack. It will be on richardhelppie.com. He is a businessman with some renown. He is also very insightful about foreign policy. Having lived in Asia for many decades, I was born in the United States, but has become a dual citizen of both Australia and the United States. I understand now you've been traveling throughout Europe for a period of months. Is that right?
Yeah, we were able to leave Australia, which we'll talk about in a moment. It was very difficult to get out of Australia. Actually, until recently in Western Australia, you had to petition, actually send in documents, significant documents to the governments to petition to leave the country. So it wasn't just about not being able to get in, you couldn't actually get out.
Could you write one for someone else to ask them to leave? Because I could see a couple people I'd like to write them for. Just kidding.
One way tickets. Okay, that's it. We'll even contribute to the tickets. So yeah, basically we left early August. We were able to come over to the U.S. and to meet with you, which was a tremendous pleasure to be in Ann Arbor, Michigan, late summer. So I was able to do quite a bit of travel, considering that it was COVID. There were a lot of times where things would close and then reopen, and we were in several states in the United States, and I was based pretty much in Europe, following the Ukraine crisis, as well as many other things up until mid-January. In January, after half a year, we returned first to Sydney, Australia. And Sydney, Australia is very different. It had opened up to the world. And then finally, to get back home here to Western Australia, we had to petition again to get back into the state. And we were fortunate as residents to get into the state. And now we're back home.
Well, I hope that things are settling in there. I hope that all of our viewers, our listeners, and our readers on all our platforms, on Substack, on podcast platforms, YouTube TV, and on Mission Control Radio, will be sure to read your column. You wrote a fascinating piece about what Australia is like today versus when you left. Robert, you're very attuned to things socially, but maybe we should start with some of the basics that Australia is a big country. And one of the things I learned from your column is that the Western Australia state is 3 times the size of the state of Texas. I can't even get my head around that. That's one state government.
Yeah, so Australia is and honestly, until you live here, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But once you're here, it does. It's pretty much split almost in the middle. So half of the country almost, which is almost the size of the United States, half of the country, imagine like from the Mississippi over to California is one state.
Okay.
And then the eastern part of the country is the rest of the states. That's kind of a rough approximation, but it gives you an idea of how large Western Australia is. And almost exactly like in the United States, Richard, it is the places for the resources. So the mining, all of those kinds of things that you would consider Western United States, generally speaking, happen in the western part of Australia.
And how many other states are there beyond Western Australia?
There's 6 states. The largest and the most populous is New South Wales, which is Sydney. Victoria, which is Melbourne. There's one called South Australia, which is exactly what it is. Tasmania, Tasmanian devil, that kind of thing. Sure. It's an island that sits off the bottom. There's Queensland to the north. And then there's a place called the Northern Territories, similar to, let's say, Arizona Territories. In other words, it's not yet a full state. And then there's Western Australia.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, you mentioned the Tasmanian devil, and I'm sure a lot of people of our generation flashed the cartoon character. And sadly, I think a lot of us flashed to Dudley Do-Right in recent days, but maybe we don't want to go there just yet. Robert, one of the things that you write so eloquently about and speak so eloquently about is the kind of this contest between mandates versus freedoms. And when we look back at our recent history, we had 9/11, and 9/11 caused some constrictions on movement. It caused some furthering ability of the state to observe what one is doing. And now we have COVID, and COVID further restricted where people could move, if they could work, what they could buy, how they must be medicated. And indeed, in Canada now, things are getting just a little bit more harsh. So what's your take, if you have an overview on this mandates versus freedoms, and how did things look in Australia when you left? How do they look today? And maybe just take us through that. Asylum seekers and all the COVID, anti-COVID measures that the state took.
Well, now that I'm going to write 6 novels about that, that's a lot of
and I'll read
areas.
them all too, so thanks.
There's a lot of area to cover. Let's start with the basics. Australia's a very remote and isolated place. It's an island. Little Tasmania is on the bottom, but basically it's an island, a continent size, almost the size of the United States. Next to it is New Zealand, which is even more remote. So Australia and New Zealand, both on their response to the pandemic was to cut off the world. Now, the only other country that actually cut off the world for a long time has been of any significance is China. Mm-hmm. So China is a totalitarian state, and China has the no COVID policy. Obviously, we all know that it started in China. And while we can argue about how it started in China, that's where it did come from and began. And their approach, as you watch the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Beijing, is still hazmat suits. Okay? So they are absolute, total isolation people. As democracies, as you talked about with mandates, democracies have a very different situation. So we do have elections. We do have to, we are accountable, at least somewhat, to the people in in the countries. And in Australia and New Zealand, and I'm lumping them together here at least, they had very similar responses, which were islands, were cutting off. The response by the...
If I may interject, then also, that's really not much different than Australia and New Zealand pre-COVID. Neither Australia nor New Zealand was particularly welcoming to asylum seekers. And they were both very difficult to immigrate to. You couldn't just show up. You had to prove that you had means, and you weren't going to be dependent on the state. So they've kind of were a little bit isolated culturally, perhaps, prior to the pandemic. Am I reading too much into that?
I think you're making thank you so much. It's a perfect digression because I kind of glossed over that. But you're absolutely right. Pandemic's one thing. But in Australia, you don't get in unless you are a person of means, or let's say a university student, college student. You can come and then you can apply for long-term residency, equivalent of a green card after you graduate, depending on your discipline. And Australia's population has grown through immigration, but definitely not through asylum seeking. That is absolutely correct. They put them off on an island, which is it's called Christmas Island, which is not a very
terrible.
What can I say the name, right? But they're still sitting there. These are Afghanis. These are Indonesians. These are anybody. And unfortunately, they're primarily Muslims from war-torn kind of places. So asylum seekers in Australia, they tried to do the boat thing. When they came down, they stopped them. They put them off. The boats no longer come down from Indonesia. They were traveling through Indonesia, doing their version of the coyotes of taking them down. But that stopped because they're sitting on islands and they're there now 5-10 years at a time. So asylum seekers are definitely not welcome in Australia, and they go slow on all of the applications. It's I don't want to say it's Guantanamo, right? But it's not a fun place to be. And Australian people, by and large, have not said a lot about that. While there is a movement to say end this type of treatment, it's not supported by the majority of the people. That being said, and this is critical, 30% of Australians right now, 30% were not born in this country.
Oh.
So 30% of the people in Australia are immigrants. Where I live, in the western part of Australia, because of South Africa and also from the UK primarily, but also from India and Indonesia, and a little lesser extent, Indonesia and Malaysia, some communities are 50%. Where I live right now, a community of 200,000 people, half of the people here, including myself, of course, and my wife, we were not born in Australia. So Australia has a very strong immigrant population, which has changed the diversity of the country. Whereas the United States has 76%, if you include Hispanic whites as white population, we only have 71% white population. That's down from 97% in the early 60s. So we are changing rapidly as a country. And the number one immigrant population in Australia are Chinese, mainland Chinese. There's 1.5 million mainland Chinese now living permanently and or citizens in Australia. So when we talk about Australia, it is no longer, it's incredibly wrong to say that Australia is a white country.
Thank you for listening or watching this segment of Richard Helppie's The Common Bridge. On Substack, you can access the full archive and bonus columns, podcasts, and interviews for only $5 a month. At substack.com, search for The Common Bridge and subscribe.